I'm so glad that all of you joined us. I'm grateful and appreciative that you could. Everybody's quite busy, but I think this is a really important issue for us to debate, discuss, present new ideas, find better solutions in how we interact with the informal sector. Participants in today's webinar include our Jobs Fund partners, without whom, of course, none of this work is possible. There are government officials, civil society organizations, researchers, and practitioners. A very warm welcome to our panelists as well, who include Gigi Alcock, entrepreneur, author, Kasinomic Revolution; Caroline Skinner, Urban Research Director, WIEGO; Lings Naidoo, CEO, Redflank; Dr. Jason Musyoka, CEO of the Frontline; and Dr. Fidelis Hove, our very own Dr. Fidelis Hove, who will be your facilitator today. He will provide a brief overview of the Jobs Fund experiences of supporting work in the informal economy. This will be followed by a panel discussion, and sufficient time will also be made for questions and answers. However, we do ask that you make use of the chat and post your questions, because often, you don't really want to wait until the end of the presentation to put your questions out there. We've also, I think you've seen, we have posted you the Menti link. It should be in the chat, but you have a link because we'd really like to make this a very, very interactive session. Let me conclude by thanking all of you who are participating today. This is very important to us as the Jobs Fund. I think we put high score to sharing what we have learned at the coalface. The experimentation, the projects, the results of those projects. And I think it's important to be able to share what we uncover at the coalface, and that then influences policy, and it also influences the work of practitioners. So thank you very much to all of you who are participating today, because sharing knowledge is really, really close to what we do in the Jobs Fund. I now hand you over to Fidelis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Najwa, and welcome to everyone. This looks to be one of those events that's going to be very exciting, and I'm hoping for wonderful insights and participation from all the delegates. I'm going to present a quick overview of the Jobs Fund's approach to challenges and opportunities in the informal economy. And so that it's easier for you to pay attention to the presentation, I'm going to stop my video. And I'm also going to flag that on Menti, the first question is already running. So if you go to Menti, you'll be able to start responding to questions that we will be posting there. In this segment, I'll cover a bit about the Jobs Fund, after which I will go into some key areas which will be expanded on by our panelists during the panel discussion. Next slide, please. By partnering with intermediaries, the fund has successfully piloted innovative models that government could channel funding to and create jobs at a greater scale. So we facilitated the creation of a total of 277,000 jobs and internships. And if you account for differences in sectors, job types, and other factors, our total cost per job has been about 28,500, and the grant cost per job about 19,450. Next slide, please. Most governments today still approach the question of informality in a dualist way. So this is problematic because it doesn't capture the existence of varying degrees of informality in employment relations and the linkages that exist between those engaging in formal and informal activities. If instead one conceives formality and informality as existing on a continuum, on one end, so that's on the left side of figure 1, we have employment that's entirely formal, so it's regulated and secure. This would be typified by jobs in formal enterprises and enterprises abiding by all labor regulations. So these jobs would have full employment contracts and also include benefits such as paid leave, notice before dismissal, and retirement contributions. In figure 2, this is represented by cell 1. On the opposite end, would have employment that's entirely informal, such as small-scale survivalist activities along the lines of street trading and such. In figure 2, that's represented by cell 4. With varying levels of security and adherence to regulations, numerous types of economic activity.
Yeah, you are there.
All points along the continuum,
Legal.
including trading, collecting waste, manufacturing, and providing services. Next slide, please. Because of the wide spectrum of employment and earning opportunities in informal economy, the Jobs Fund has had to adopt innovative ways of evidencing jobs and other outcomes. One needs to be very circumspect about how you define things. So how you define the informal economy is important because official definitions determine official statistics, and these in turn impact on policy. So some have argued that the official Stats SA definition underestimates the level of informal employment, as more people would be classified as informally employed if additional elements like paid leave, access to pension and other social protection benefits are taken into account, as is the case with, to a certain extent, the ILO definition. So while the Stats SA definition gives a figure of 2.5, 2.6 million people in informal employment in 2020, so that's 17% of the total. According to the broader ILO definition, in 2018, that figure was double that percentage. It was 34%, which is still relatively low compared to other developing countries, as shown in figure 3. These are pre-COVID statistics, by the way, and so our panelists will have to help us unpack how COVID has impacted these numbers. May I ask delegates to mute, please, so that there's minimum interruption. Another important consideration is the fact that, you know, the country's informal sector has traditionally been an outlier for another reason, and that's historically there have been proportionally more people in informal waged employment than those in informal self-employment. So this is due to our historical and political context. There also seems to be a dominant narrative that the informal economy is only made up of spaza shops and street traders. But if you look at figure 4, using the Stats SA definition, you can see that there's a significant number of informally employed individuals in other sectors as well. Of course, income from informal work mostly flows to poor households. Rogan and others have done research showing that in terms of impact on poverty, the destruction of 100 jobs in the informal sector in South Africa is equivalent to a loss of 60 to 80 formal sector jobs. Next slide, please. So our view is that the informal economy should be supported, and there are a number of areas where stakeholders can raise the bar. I'm just going to go through a quick summary of our understanding of current gaps, looking at 4 main areas. The first is the funding environment. Here, key role players include commercial banks, public sector funders at various levels, DFIs, etc. But what's also crucial are the funding models available. So here we're talking about where funders source their money and the way in which that funding is then structured and offered to beneficiaries. Some estimate that the funding gap for SMMEs, including those in the informal economy, could be in the region of 500 billion. I'm sure our panelists will help us unpack the impact of funder requirements for security, as well as other strict eligibility criteria that are typically applied. When it comes to the enterprise support ecosystem, of great importance we found are the sector and enterprise development models, because they determine how role players like government, corporates, and the informal enterprises themselves interact. And what we've seen is that support to informal enterprises is often patchy and there's a lack of comprehensive sector-specific support. In terms of the enabling environment, we find that South Africa's history of legislation restricting business activities among the Black population has undoubtedly reduced the extent of informal activity in the country. So there's a lot of work to be done on that aspect. But also of critical importance are the macro factors. And I know Caroline has done a lot of research on this, and Lings and his team are part of the Beyond COVID business survey. So we're going to get further insights from them on this as well. Next slide, please. We see three main focus areas with respect to how we can improve support to informal economy participants. The first problem is that of reach. So how do you reach as many informal enterprises as you can? The second is about how you support them once you've reached them. And then the third is about ensuring their sustainability. Internationally, intermediaries such as sector organizations, microfinance institutions, and tech companies have succeeded in reaching and supporting informal enterprises by playing an aggregation role. So in other words, that's helping to cultivate a pipeline of informal enterprises who can then be provided a wide range of services and support. One example is India's Sewa, but closer to home, through a state and World Bank funded program, Kenya has also managed to develop its informal sector through partnerships with sector associations. And these have now been aggregated to a national level. And this provides the right scale and an entry point for banks, insurance companies, large retailers, and mobile network operators to provide different services and assistance. In South Africa, there's clearly an opportunity for us to raise the bar in respect of this. Next slide, please. So once you've reached informal enterprises, how do you support them? To produce a marketable product or service, informal enterprises need to perform all the business functions of larger businesses, as shown on our screens. But unlike larger enterprises, they don't have the skills, they don't have the capital for them to acquire these resources for these functions at a low cost. So intermediaries supported by the Jobs Fund provide the benefits of greater scale to their beneficiaries and members, and so allow them to get better supplies, to get lower pricing, and to access a broader range of suppliers. I know Jason and Gigi will have more to say on this aspect. Our intermediaries have also enabled access to market, which is critically important. For example, our development of small-scale farmers into high-yield, commercially sustainable operations wasn't going to be possible if it wasn't for the fact that these intermediaries offer offtake agreements, or they facilitate access to offtake agreements. In fact, through about 20 intermediaries working with informal enterprises, the fund has created at least 31,000 jobs. So clearly the intermediary model can work in our context, and our institutional capacity building funding window is structured to channel more resources into the development and growth of more intermediaries. Next slide, please. As we think about each informal enterprise's growth journey, one topical issue is that of formalization. And I think I'll highlight three aspects that are worth engaging on. In terms of employment, the thrust is often on shifting people out of informal self-employment and informal wage employment into wage jobs that are formal. But the reality is that our economy currently doesn't create new formal jobs at an adequate rate. In terms of tax registration, all enterprises, including those in the informal economy, already pay VAT on inputs that they purchase from formal sector firms, but they typically don't claim VAT refunds. It's also doubtful that significant tax revenue would be collected from charging informal enterprises income tax, and many are likely to fall below the tax threshold in any case. Then finally, the third aspect that I hope we'll be engaging on are the municipal regulations and licensing requirements, which are often necessary. I think if you think about enterprises making and selling food, but there are arguments that these are sometimes overdone, especially where the authority's primary aim is to collect revenue as opposed to supporting enterprises. So we are of the view that informal economy enterprises should be provided with tailor-made packages of support, which may include appropriate elements of formalization at different stages of the enterprise's growth journey. So in terms of our presentation, that's the end of it. And I'm sure we are all keen to hear more on these issues from our panel of experts. And to set the scene for a panel discussion, we are going to see a clip on one of the Jobs Fund's informal economy initiatives. Thank you.
A2Pay is a proud South African fintech company aimed at growing local and traditional traders through technology and training. A2Pay have developed a full business management system for the retailer to better understand and grow their business. This system offers the business owner a number of benefits, such as a full point of sale system to sell all general items, stock management with sales and profit reports on a daily, weekly, and a monthly basis, the ability to sell popular prepaid services, and much more. The system is constantly evolving, and A2Pay has spent a number of years ensuring that it solves the major challenges faced by the retail owner. A2Pay has two divisions within the business that include a Jobs Fund program and a commercial operation. The Jobs Fund program is supported by the National Treasury and aims to equip store owners with all the necessary knowledge and technology to grow their business and create more employment. Through this program, the store owner and the employee, which is the operator, will attend a 6-week coaching program to assist them on their pathway to success. A number of incentives can be achieved on this pathway, where the ultimate goal is to turn the store into a financial hub, which is highly lucrative for the owner.
Within 6 months' time, I can see the profit, I can see my loss and where the problem is.
To see where I got lost, to see my profits actually every week, so and to maintain my stock accordingly.
Uphinde futhi wazi ukuthi ubudget kanjani ukusebenzisa isystem.
The day I got the machine, I'll tell you, I only had one fridge from Coca-Cola. I've got 4 fridges from Coca-Cola altogether. Now my income is up.
It's helped me to improve, to grow my business.
The other benefit of the machine is that it sells all the prepaid products.
It's many in one. You pay DSTV, you play your lotto, you buy everything that you want in one machine. Isn't it brilliant?
And I want to thank A2Pay for bringing the machines to us, because at least they have put us somewhere. Even if we die now, they say those were the first people who have started scanning. You see, they have put us on the map now.
Finally, and as part of A2Pay's ongoing evolution, a recently launched A2Pay Financial Services Division can now provide a store owner with working capital to grow their business, provided they use their BizBoss 2 daily. The pilot started in KZN in 2019 and will expand to other regions in 2020. A2Pay will continue to grow and support local and traditional traders.
Thank you so much to our partners A2Pay for allowing us to share that clip with a wider audience today. That was both inspiring and insightful. A lot of the statements from those A2Pay beneficiaries are thought-provoking and actually allow us to transition well into a panel discussion segment. I'll now ask our panelists to introduce themselves. Starting with Jason.
Thank you so much, Fidelis. I hope I am clear enough from my side.
We can hear you.
Thank you so much. So my name is Jason. I am the CEO of the Frontline Group. It's a research company based in Pretoria. We do research on development and policy. I'm also a senior researcher at the University of Pretoria. I'm a development economist by training. I've done extensive work around issues of political economy that involves local economic development, informal economy, and regional development. So in summary, that's my short pedigree there. Thanks, Fidelis.
Thank you so much, Jason. Gigi?
Hi, everyone. My name's Gigi Alcock. I am sure. Basically, my background is I grew up in a mud hut in a Zulu village in a place called Msinga, KwaZulu. And I'm a businessman. I've been a businessman involved in this sector for many years with a business called Mina Nawe Marketing. I've recently sold that business to an international company and now operate under my Kasinomics brand. And in essence, the Kasinomics is 2 books I've written about the informal sector, Kasinomics, and then my follow-on recent book, Kasinomic Revolution, which are really about the economies and the lifestyles and the people in that sector, which first of all are often unrecognized or invisible, but more importantly, where there's massive revolution happening and change happening, and I believe the economic engine for a lot of our economy. And I'm currently have kind of almost entered the informal sector. I see myself as an economic activist. By entering the informal sector, I invested in a number of Kasi businesses and startups, everything from the Muti sector to the food sector to online delivery and so on. And I just know that I'll at least have something to write about, either great failures or great successes, or probably both. Thank you.
Thanks, Gigi. Hopefully it's great successes. Caroline?
Hi, everybody. My name is Caroline Skinner. I'm based at the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town. But I also work for the international global think tank, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. And we, a core constituency for us are worker-based movements. So in fact, Fidelis, I was interested to see that you had highlighted SEWA. They've been around for 40 years and are actually the kind of powerhouse, the original powerhouse behind WIEGO, who really felt that we needed a kind of international think tank. And in a South African context, we've got lots of membership-based organizations of informal workers who we service and also we monitor, and I'll speak a bit about this in the panel discussion, developments in the informal economy. So we've kind of got our ears to the ground about what's happening, and that's supplemented with the research that we do. So a real lovely opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Absolute pleasure to have you here. Lings?
Thank you, Fidelis. So really good to be part of the session today. So my name is Lings Naidoo. I'm a director with Redflank. I'm also a founding member of Beyond COVID. Redflank is a management consultancy. We do quite a lot of work with on enterprise development. So we've probably worked with hundreds of SMEs over the years and worked with quite a few developmental institutions such as the Jobs Fund. I consider myself, Gigi, I really like your title. I consider myself a reformed capitalist. So I think, the power that Redflank and Beyond COVID can bring to the mix is that we have a lot of experience in the private sector, understanding what it is that makes businesses successful. And I think there's a massive opportunity to translate that into the developmental space, whether it's SMEs in general, or we're talking about informal sector in particular. So looking forward to the discussion today, looking to make a contribution. And Fidelis mentioned the Beyond COVID survey that's been conducted recently. It indicates that SMEs plan to shed 1.2 million jobs in the next 6 months. And if you look at our employment base of about 14 million, that's a big chunk. They say that they need 1.1 trillion rands to stay open over the next 12 months. So some sobering stats there, and I think sessions such as this under the leadership of the Jobs Fund can make a massive difference in terms of turning the tide and address some of the systemic issues, the fault lines of which we are seeing now through circumstances such as beyond
Absolutely. COVID. Thank you so much, Lings, for that introduction and context. And just so we can get right into it, the systemic issues you mentioned, Lings, I'm going to kick it off with a question to Caroline. So, Caroline, what do you see as the current challenges for informal economy businesses?
Phew. I mean, it's just to really echo Lings's sentiment. The COVID moment or the COVID period has been brutal, particularly on the informal sector. So, all the data, if it's the NIDS-CRAMS data, I've just chosen to reflect the quarterly labor force survey statistics on the screen here really show that the informal sector was disproportionately hard hit, but women's job losses were greater in all types of employment. So we're seeing that, globally, so much so that, many are referring to this recession as a C-session rather than a recession. So the recovery has been slow. We saw 641,000 jobs lost in hard lockdown from the informal sector. In Q3, you can see that kind of slow recovery of 176 increase in Q3, and then another 65,000 in Q4. So, and again, men are 3 times more likely to return to informal sector jobs than women. So we've got to kind of keep that gender story front of mind. The important thing with the informal sector is even with those people who are back at work, it doesn't mean that they are earning the same amount. So we've done some survey work in the inner city of Durban and found that those who are working, 55%, they're earning 55% of what they were earning pre-lockdown. So the major constraint at the moment is lack of demand, and we're hearing this from all our worker-based movements. And to me, it suggests something around, a broad economic stimulus being the #1 intervention priority. So cash grants, we know, are a very effective way to get monies into the hands of poor people, both to restart businesses, but also to deal with the constrained demand. So, I think that this, we know all the data backs up that particularly the child support grant is incredibly well targeted at informal households with informal workers in them. So it's kind of getting the giant wheels of the economy going. So I wanted to just flag, obviously the extension of the special COVID grant is a hot topic at the moment. There's a particular issue around the fact that if you secure a child support grant, you can't get the special COVID grant. So there's and it's so much from a gender perspective sufficiently problematic that it could be challenged in court. So we really need to look at how to get the giant kind of wheels of the economy going, and the cash grants are critical to informal sector businesses. Just a final word, obviously, there was R500 million allocated to SMME support. We can go into detail, a little bit more detail, but we're seeing that around about 3 million informal sector enterprises are really struggling to get these monies. So by way of example, we meet with street trader organization and leaders across the country once a month, and none of them have been able to access the TREP support. So literally, and specifically the grant that's targeted at fruit and vegetable traders. So there's something going on there that we need to kind of unpack.
Thanks, Caroline. So there are issues of eligibility criteria there that I think you're flagging. Gigi, do you have a response or anything to add in terms of current challenges and what you've seen with the COVID, with the impact of the pandemic?
Yeah, so I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, on the one hand, the positive thing about the informal sector and the impact of the pandemic has been up to 80% of informal businesses are based in a residential area, so they're obviously able to operate whether it's being completely legal or not. You know, hair salon, you can walk down the road, and so on. So we've seen, you know, people being able to do that. We've also seen remarkable resilience in informal businesses and the ability, because of low overheads and stuff, to literally be able to buckle down and kind of wait out the storm, as it were. Where we've seen a big issue is certainly where Caroline mentioned, in the lack of demand, literally across the board, whether it's a gasi mechanic or a spaza shop or a hawker or a bakery or even a fast food outlet, certainly lack of demand. What we've also seen is also the ability of people to recover and start trading again, because they've in essence used up their resources. And now, for instance, a hair salon needs to buy a relaxer, or a gorda outlet has to buy bread and polony or whatever it might be. And so many of these really haven't got those resources. And I think this is a tragedy to a large extent, is that with a little bit of help, you know, there was 200 billion rand odd credit guarantee offered, and yet it was really, I spoke to many of the banks, you know, they're not able to disperse funding or loans or so on at that level of, say, 5 or 10,000 or 25,000 rand that would be needed by someone to restock their business or their store. And I think there's an urgent need for this kind of thing, almost like, and I say it with huge hesitancy, but the ability of you know, micro loans to small businesses, or grants or whatever, it does not exist. And in a sense, because the financial institutions aren't geared to do this kind of stuff, they can only give big loans, they can't administer it. The micro lending sector can do this, but they are exorbitant and questionable sometimes in terms of ethics and affordability and so on. And so I think there's a middle ground there, and I think A2Pay has done very well in terms of that kind of thing, but I think there's a lot more needed across a broader spectrum, not only in the spaza sector, and will continue to be needed to kind of grow these businesses beyond just the impact of COVID.
Absolutely. And I think the role of intermediaries in facilitating that aggregation is absolutely critical. Lings, so we've heard a lot about the challenges, but can you talk more about what has been done, and perhaps maybe look at what where we can raise the bar? Lings?
Certainly, Fidelis. And I think, you know, when you talk about raising the bar, it underlines the importance of understanding at a fundamental level where the sector is at with regards to the support ecosystem that surrounds informal businesses. So if we look at that support ecosystem, government is clearly an important aspect of that, together with developmental institutions outside of the government sector, such as NGOs as an example, and then the private sector as well. So interestingly, you know, when you look at the informal sector, and Fidelis alluded to this, you know, there's degrees of informality. So interestingly, it's not just what you would consider an informal trader to be informal, but as you move up the scale in terms of size, small businesses and medium-sized businesses can also operate at a degree of informality. So when we look at the informal sector, we need to take a bit of a broader perspective to start with regards to the SMME sector itself. So if you look at SMMEs, government, developmental institutions, and private sector all provide degrees of support. Interestingly, government provides about 17 billion rands worth of support to the SMME sector, whereas the private sector provides more, around 32 billion in terms of enterprise development programs. When we look at when we look at the informal sector, the sad reality of the support that's provided, so coming from the top half of the slide, is that only 2% of the support that is geared towards SMMEs finds its way to informal sector businesses. And if you look at particular institutions, for instance, NYDA, they have programs that are specifically targeted towards informal sector businesses. The same with the Department of Small Business Development. So through CEDA, provides support to informal businesses. We did an analysis of the annual reports for the departments of economic development and tourism across all 9 provinces. And while we found evidence of programs focused on SMMEs, very little of that was finding its way through to informal sector businesses themselves. So if you look at those neon bubbles on the slide, there's the Department of Small Business through CEDA focuses about 800,000 on informal sector businesses, smaller amounts from NYDA and the provinces. If you add those up, it's less than R1 million that's specifically targeted towards informal sector businesses. Now, the good news is that there are lots of well-intentioned organizations out there that really want to make a difference. The challenge is they typically operate within certain parameters. So if you look at CEDA as an example, the assistance is focused in particular areas such as training. The challenge then is, how we take the support that is available from all of these institutions and structure it in such a way that it makes a fundamental difference. And I'll give you just a simple example. We do some pro bono work. In the Northern Cape, we assisted a SMME village that was set up there as a joint venture between a local mine who put up the stalls, so people didn't have to trade from under a tree anymore. The municipality then partnered with CEDA to provide training. And we visited about 6 months after they'd set up. What we found is, and this is where the middle of the slide comes in, they were given access to infrastructure. So, Auntie Miriam, running Miriam's Takeaway, said it was so nice to be able to plug a refrigerator into an electricity socket and be able to lock up a good so she didn't have to cut it up and down, every day. She really appreciated the training on how to manage finances, some entrepreneurial training. But she said, what she really needed was access to a bakkie so she didn't have to go to the butcher shop every day to pick up a meat. Now, where the support that is more holistic, I think, has proved more, has enabled small businesses to move into success is outfits like A2Pay. So, what we saw in the video just now in terms of having a terminal that they could record their sales on, having a terminal that they can sell telecom, Eskom electricity on. Enabling technology is critical and transformational change. So with one of the Jobs Fund programs, it's not just focused on helping emerging farmers, but through providing enabling services like access to offtake agreements so they have assured sales, they move them into the smallholder farmer space and eventually to the commercial farmer space. So in summary, with regards to the support that's there, I think there are organizations that are doing good work. There isn't much, there isn't enough of it. So as we pointed out, 2% of the support for the SMME sector finds its way to informal sector businesses. For the support to make a difference, you need coverage of all 6 of these support areas, what we call 360-degree support. Most of the support at the moment for SMMEs generally speaking, as opposed to just informal sector businesses, is on training, which tends to be once off and can't be considered, fundamentally improving capability. Infrastructure, which does make a big difference, and through organizations like CIFA, access to funding. What we need is we need enabling services such as access to packaging for emerging farmers, access to offtake agreements for most small businesses, access to enabling technology, such as what's being achieved with one of the Jobs Fund programs at the moment, A2Pay, about, and others, and then transformational change. You need to stay with the small business as it becomes, more bankable, so that you can eventually, when you take the training wheels off, the banks are able to lend them the money they need, and they're able to access the other types of resources they need to be more successful. And that's ultimately, the goal we'll be targeting.
Absolutely.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Lings, for those insights. And I think some of the elements you spoke about touch back on the issue of formalization. So, Caroline, what are the opportunities and costs of formalization?
Thanks, Fidelis. You know, I think formalization means different things to different people. And, you know, if we look back over the last 20 years of informal sector support in South Africa, the informal sector has been too frequently subject to the punitive arm of the state. And to me, this also spotlights what's happening at local authorities. So local authorities are key players here. And if anything, over the COVID period, we're seeing this more than has ever happened. So there's a lot of confiscation of goods. And what really we need to see is the informal sector being brought into the protective arm of the state. So formalization, you know, tends to narrowly focus on regulating and taxing informal enterprises. Frederick and Faria and I spent a lot of time, you know, through a process supported by the presidency and others in the room, kind of looking at the income stats, and really it shows that very few informal sector enterprises earn enough to be taxed. So it might be the wrong kind of focus. So we definitely need to simplify bureaucratic procedures, but there's got to be an offering of benefits and incentives in return for paying taxes for those who, you know, who earn enough. So I'm quite struck by a country that's had a lot of success in bringing people into the registration and tax system in Brazil, and there's a lovely incentive in return for coming into the registration procedures of being in the social protection net. So that's the kind of conceptual framework we need to kind of work towards. Also, just another issue is the fact that the informal sector is a very lumpy notion. So, Fidelis, I was really happy to see that sector breakdown. You know, I think in the public discourse, when you think informal sector, you only think about street traders and spaza shops, and they're only 4 in every 10 informal sector operators in those segments of the informal sector. There's such a diversity. And formalization will mean different things to different segments within the informal sector. So, you know, just to name 2 groups or 3 groups, for street traders, formalization involves secure access to public space, licenses to sell, identity cards, but particularly infrastructure support. So, you know, looking at Lings' lovely framework, we've got to pick up infrastructure is profoundly important for secure enterprises. And it's also thinking of, you know, so it's infrastructure, you know, storage is critical, but also homes are often workplaces. So even, you know, informal settlement, upgrading, you know, low-cost housing is an economic intervention. But, you know, in terms of formalization for waste pickers, it's access to waste, it's contracts, and there's lovely examples of remuneration from municipalities for the public service that waste pickers are providing, including, you know, mitigation of climate change. And then for home-based workers, kind of secure and transparent contracts that provide for fair prices and piece rates, but also that basic infrastructure. So, you know, there's something important about unpacking what we mean by formalization, and you know, using these frameworks to think through it in a way that secures livelihoods rather than destroys them, which happens quite a lot and is certainly happening significantly at the moment.
Absolutely. Thank you, Caroline. I'm interested to hear from Gigi and Jason in terms of a response to some of the points that Caroline has raised. Jason, you can come in.
Thank you so much, Fidelis. I like the points. I have to first indicate that what I didn't mention earlier, Caroline was my lecturer a couple of years ago in around 2006. Wow. He lectured me on informal economy. So I'm in a bit of a tight spot here as far as responding to some of the issues. I have a lot of respect to the work that she does. But I also want to take you, Caroline, to task on the point that you keep on mentioning about spaza shops are not the informal economy. Well, they are not the whole of the informal economy. And I think that is absolutely accurate, but then you get back to just indicating or making reference to the informal sector. And I think, as you might be aware, the conceptual arguments put forward are that we probably need to, even the definition of the sector itself, or calling these informal activities as a sector, is self-defeating in a way. And therefore, rather referring to these activities as informal economy is a much more credible, or perhaps a much more inclusive way of looking at multiple sectors that constitute informal economic activities. So I think that's perhaps one of the issues that I'd like to hear what Caroline might have to say about that. But also, secondly, I do fully agree with the fact that formalization has tended to be really just a template. And if you look at most of the papers or academic work that has been done, but also policy work in South Africa, it seems to suggest that the way to go for the informal economy is to formalize them. And we don't ask the hard questions of what kind of formalization, what grades of formalization should be. But also, I suppose, we could also pose the question whether we should really do formalization in the first place. It's a study that we did some time ago and developing an informal economy policy for one of the local municipalities, and an overwhelming majority of those that we surveyed, the informal traders and so on, they suggested we would like to grow, but we don't want to formalize. What about that perspective of really just supporting these activities without necessarily introducing the notion or narrative of formalization? I think those are questions that we need and discussions that we need to have. Fidelis.
Thank you so much. And I think you're raising very important points. And to my mind, given Gigi's involvement with the private sector, Gigi, maybe you can also speak to, you can weigh in on how corporates can participate in supporting informal enterprises, however we define them. Clearly, definitions and those conceptual frameworks are important, but practically, how can corporates actually participate and add value? Gigi?
Cool, thanks, Fidelis. So I just want to mention something about the topic that Caroline spoke about, and I think just two very quick things. The first is that there's an assumption that these businesses do not want to kind of pay rent and other things in terms of the spaces that they trade in. And so, this kind of enforcement of bylaws and stuff like that comes into place, which is not, the fact is that incentive-based mechanisms work much better. There's some remarkable work done by an organization called Asiya Dafuleni in the Warwick Triangle in Durban, where they've actually, traders are, have kind of entered into arrangements with the municipality and so on. And despite kind of lots of bureaucratic things in the way, people pay rent, keep the place clean, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think this is the way that it should be looked at. The second very quick issue is that the assumption is that that the only thing that we want to get from the informal sector through formalization is them paying tax, because that's the only way we see them contributing to the economy. But we ignore the fact that there are other ways that this sector is contributing massively to the economy. One, as an example, is that they all pay VAT on their purchases, and often these purchases are substantial, and that they are net payers of VAT. They do not claim VAT back like many other businesses. The other element is that driving economic activity through businesses from Tiger Brands to Unilever to whoever else it might be, who we hope are paying tax on their purchases that they're selling to these people. So, and then, we often don't consider the massive drag on the economy we would have if these people did not earn the money that they earn from this economy and sustain their livelihoods, put their kids at school, and so on and so forth. So we need to look very carefully at the economic contribution that the sector is making to our economy. Then to my thing about corporate participation, I think to a large extent corporates often are looking at an extractive basis of wanting to engage in the sector. And I think we need to change that dynamic, and it was one of the things I tried to do in my corporate life. And I'll just give some examples from the pictures we have. I mean, maybe just to rewind, often the sense is like, corporates like large retailers, for argument's sake, ShopRite, the sense is, look how many jobs we're creating. And the assumption is that everyone wants to be an employee. Well, I think a large number of the informal sector businesses are proud of their business. They're proud of the turnover they make. They've been in that business, mean average of up to 6 to 8 years that people have been in business in the sector. They don't want to just be employees. And in these businesses, we need to look at kind of reciprocal relationships. On the right-hand side and the bottom there are mechanics who in the township, these mechanics purchase their spares from the spares shop, AutoZone or Midas. And then, you come and you park your car and you want your brakes replaced. The mechanic buys the brakes, replaces them there, and you drive off. And you kind of say, well, why doesn't AutoZone or Midas put up some sort of workshops where these guys can operate? They are customers of AutoZone or Midas, and yet there's no reciprocal benefit. They're just seen as customers. And we see this across a range of things. Backroom rental is a massive rental business, 20 billion rand odd in incomes received for backroom rental, one of the largest growing sectors in the informal economy. And yet someone who builds a back room cannot get funding or a home loan to build another back room because the rental agreements that may be in place for a back room are not seen or not accepted by the finance regulator as a form of affordability or proof of income. Why not? That happens to me when I'm renting a house in the suburbs. And there's many examples where we've seen reciprocal relationships. I've written about it. I launched Parmalat cheese slices in the township economy, and we built a program called Parmalat Puma Pambili, where in essence it was a loyalty program where Parmalat invested in people who were buying buying cheese for Gordas and Amagwinya, and they could earn things like containers, they could earn equipment for their store, they could earn branding, tables and chairs, and we saw many of these outlets benefiting and actually purchasing more of these products. But I think to a large extent, these relationships don't exist. Companies come in and they say, well, either we want you to come and buy from us, or they are supplier relationships which are unequal. These supplier relationships are in essence, you supply your bakery supplying bread to a large retailer. Anyone who's been a supplier will know that these relationships are unequal, unsustainable, and we need to change that dynamic. So corporate participation is incredibly important. I think it is an area of demand. It is an area of opportunity. It's an area where corporates can invest, but there's not enough of it currently, and the form of it is often, as I said earlier, very extractive. Thank you.
Definitely, Gigi. Thank you for highlighting all those aspects, including the challenges. And I think, Jason, you've been evaluating quite a number of JobsFund initiatives. Maybe you can weigh in on some of these aspects, the uneven corporate relationships, and or maybe they are even. What have you seen in terms of the evaluations that you've carried out on JobsFund initiatives?
Thank you, Fidelis. So really just briefly what we did, we did an impact assessment of the involvement of JobsFund in SMMEs, specifically spaza shops. There were two components, but I'll speak to the spaza shops in particular. And this is through the intermediaries through which SMMEs are supported by giving them or providing for them vending machines that assist their businesses. So in other words, technology support. And really briefly, what we found of the studies that we did, we did a study that looked at we controlled between treatment and control spaza shops, the treatment being those that were provided, and that we did just over 200, and another plus minus 200 that were controlled, that were not provided with vending machine technology. Our findings were that over the period of the assessment, or when the project was running, which is between 2015 all the way to 2020, we found out that on average there was a 20% increase in average monthly turnover over the treatment spaza shops. In other words, the vending machine technology seemed to, and most of the spaza shop owners that we interviewed, they attributed the increase, or the 20% increase of their monthly turnover to the vending machine technology. That was quite telling from the study. We also found out that 2/3 of the supported spaza shops were found to be implementing improved business practices. So they were not just improving on their revenues, but they also seemed to bundle up their business activities with improved business practices, which included maintaining purchase and sales receipts, undertaking consistent stock management, as well as maintaining separate personal and business accounts. So this does seem to suggest that there is an incentive perhaps, or a momentum towards running an entrepreneurial exercise proper. And then thirdly, we found out that as spaza shop owners, they tend to begin in terms of how they perceive their businesses. The vending machine technology seems to shift the thinking or the perception of business owners, where they now see their business more as a source of livelihood rather than a survivalist enterprise. And I think that is very critical, considering that most of the studies that have been done on South African spaza shops suggest that the reason for the high rate of failure is because the spaza shop owners, they consider their businesses more of supplementary for household income, and therefore more as a survivalist activity rather than a source of livelihood. And again, most of the studies suggest that if you look at the foreign-owned spaza shops, the Somali-owned spaza shops, the Bangladeshi-owned, and so on, they tend to consider or perceive their businesses as a source of livelihood. And that makes a huge difference in terms of the sustainability of the business itself. Then just 2 points to sum up on that. Our conclusion out of the study that we did was that South African spaza shops do show signs of growth if they are inserted into corporate value chains and PPP frameworks, public-private partnership frameworks. And secondly, spaza shop owners, they do have the potential to develop competitiveness through direct technology assistance. And maybe just mention here that, again, a lot of studies that have been done from the Sustainable Livelihoods Foundation and others who've done on informal work, they do suggest that direct assistance of spaza shops does yield some positive results. Our study, though, refined that to suggest that that might not necessarily be the case if you consider the stats from CEDA and others, of which, although they provide direct support to small businesses or informal economy, the failure rate is still high. But our study suggested that when you provide direct assistance in form of technology, there seems to be almost a clear-cut progress of that particular enterprise. So that really is ultimately, those are our 2 key conclusions, Fidelis.
Thanks, Jason. And Lings, you've also been evaluating Jobs Fund initiative. Anything to add in terms of what Jason has just shared with us?
I think broad statement to start off with, Fidelis, and that, and I say this with the utmost sincerity, that the Jobs Fund has pioneered so many models that have proven to be effective where others have failed with regards to job creation, that it really behooves us to understand these models for job creation, such as A2Pay, and how we can leverage that going forward. I think what it's illustrated is that with regards to the program we reviewed, for instance, it's so important to get fundamentals, a couple of key fundamentals right if we really want to enable not just systemic change, but practical change that makes a difference to informal sector businesses on the ground. So the program that we reviewed was responsible for extending the value chains, particularly the supply value chains for spaza shops. So as you know, spaza shops wouldn't necessarily be able to easily access all of the products that they would want to be able to sell. An example of a program that's done that well is A2Pay, where the point of sale terminals allow for sale of products such as airtime. The particular program we looked at was looking at getting, nuts and bolts products from a supplier that had committed to extending its supply chain into townships. So for anyone who's tried to do a delivery, an online delivery to a township, it's close to impossible. The online retailers, the retailers in South Africa as an example, have very well-established delivery networks going into the suburbs. But when it comes to townships, even city centers, their delivery networks are not that good. And that's where this program was looking to help. As part of the extension of that delivery network out to spaza shops, what the corporate that was supporting the program also undertook to provide training and provide support in the form of the sales rep and the driver that went out to the spaza shops to provide training to the spaza shop owners. The program worked quite well from the supply chain extension perspective, and it still appears to be going strong from that perspective. So the supply chain is still extending out to the spaza shops. The employees of the corporate involved, the manufacturer, they report that they picked up good training in terms of performing their function as part of the distribution network, and they indicate that they've also benefited from improvements in career prospects through development they've got received as part of the program. The spaza shops appear to have, they appear to have benefited to a lesser extent. So some of them are no longer carrying the products in question, so the expansion of their product baskets has dropped. What this points to, and I think this is important learning going forward, is that when it comes to supporting SMMEs, including informal businesses, it's very important to provide 360-degree support. And we need to move out of the handout phase or the support mindset to an enablement mindset. So if we look at the diagram that's on your screen at the moment, we can't just provide one enabling service as an example and one element of transformational change or one element in terms of training. You need to ensure that you provide the support that all of the enablement that a SMME requires to be successful. So as an example, in the case of the program that we reviewed, providing access to products is one thing, but if you don't help the spaza shop to access products at a lower price through collective purchasing agreements as an example, which would fall under enabling services, if you aren't able to access them, provide them with the access to funding. So as an example, we worked with an informal trader who would take a taxi once a month from an outlying area to Johannesburg to buy stock and then take it back. She had an incredibly well-established customer base, and they were clamoring for more product, but she didn't have enough money to buy enough stock so that she could meet that demand. So the key point with regards to the program that we review is I think it's a big step in the right direction, but in order to really lift businesses out of the quagmire of almost operating hand to mouth, what we need to do is we need to bear in mind that the SMME and the informal sector is very susceptible to risk. If you look at COVID as an example, with Beyond COVID, we've established that a small business at the moment is 26 times more likely to be closed than a corporate. So I just want to pause on that stat for a second, 26 times more likely. With regards to corporates, almost half of them are back to business as usual. Larger corporates such as mine's, 10% of them are actually operating on greater than normal capacity. What we need to do is we need to provide the enablement that SMMEs need, not just to build capabilities, but the support services around them. As an example, for an emerging farmer, providing packaging facilities so that when their product ends up on a shelf at SPAR, it is taken as seriously as a product from a more established commercial farmer. So that's the key thing that we need to do. We need to enable small businesses and informal businesses to access the scale that they aren't able to access on their own. And the way to do that is through initiatives such as A2Pay or the Urban Agriculture Initiative that bring SMMEs together, negotiate on their behalf, or partner with the mid-size company to be able to access the things they can't access normally. And if we can do that and get it right, what we do is we make the informal sector businesses and the SMMEs bankable. And if they are bankable, then it frees up, the credit markets and all the kinds of support that they require.
Just hold that thought, Lings, in terms of the overarching elements that we need to cover. Just going back to the two evaluations or experiences that Jason and Lings has covered, I would like to get some reaction from our two panelists, Caroline and Gigi. Do you have any questions and areas you'd want Lings and Jason to expand on based on the evaluations they've just explained to us? We can start with Caroline.
No, I mean, I think that a lot of the ground is covered, and what's heartening is to see the shift to almost what I would see as a kind of value chain approach of really understanding where informal operators fit in a bigger economy. So I think that's conceptually definitely where we should be going. So lovely to see this, and then around that is the second component of the kind of regulatory support structures. So yeah, very interesting set of reflections.
Thank you. Gigi?
Yeah, so look, I agree 100% with Lings in terms of the enabling space and really, that's what we need a lot more of. What enabling and empowering means are different things, but I'll try and come back to that. I just think that there's also, when we talk about formalization and we talk about regulation and so on, we apply it to the informal sector. But what about, there's the recent Competition Commission Grocery Retail Inquiry, which made recommendations that were voluntary, had to be abided by on a voluntary basis. And these included the fact that whatever ShopRite got in terms from a company like Unilever, they should get the same from should get the same for a Spaza shop and so on. And there's a whole bunch of recommendations that were made. Why aren't these enforced? Because I think that we'll find that it levels the playing ground substantially. And what we tend to kind of assume is that, all business is equal and that the informal business or small business is able to compete on a fair playing ground. And that's why we have things like the Competition Commission, but it's not fair. And so when we have an inquiry like that, making these findings, then it's toothless. And I think that that's terrible, because I think the opportunities, a simple exercise like just enforcing that Competition Commission retail inquiry recommendations would make a massive difference. I see my sliders come up. Should I carry on in terms of that?
Carry on, Gigi.
Sure. So I think just in terms of to kind of, in a sense, continue with the formalization exercise or question and whether they should formalize. I think the starting point and the massive, massive mistake that we make in the sector, both in support and in any discussions, is the singular thing which Caroline also mentioned, that is just hawkers and spaza shops make up the informal economy. And, I've written about this extensively, but, if you look at it, over and above the spaza and hawkers, you have Kasinomics, you have backroom rental, you have goat breeding and sales, you have the less legal dacha sector, hair salons and barbers. There's catering, massive catering sector for funerals, unveilings, and so on. Internet cafes, the Muti sector is worth 18 billion rand a year, the herbal Muti sector. There's the whole gasikos or fast food sector, which is worth about 100 billion rand a year. The taxi industry, baking industry, home building and decor is a massive sector in terms of renovations to township homes or building back rooms. Steelworks, there's a massive school mamas who sell snacks to kids and meals to kids. And I could carry on. We would not look at the formal economy and say, well, let's create a solution to the formal economy. We would do a sectorial approach to this, and we would look at it at different industries and different sectors, the entertainment sector, and so on and so forth. So that's a starting point, is that when we look at any regulation, when we look at any enablement and empowerment, every one of these sectors are going to need a slightly different form of support. So we need to recognize this diversity and sectorial kind of thing. I think the other thing is about what are the ways of formalizing that can be done, or the forms of empowering and enablement. And I was in America 2 years ago, first time I'd been to America, and I drove my wife mad because I was in New York and I kept going to these hot dog stands and saying, how do you get permission to trade here? And, finding that these guys had been there for generations, and the hot dog stands are seen as a feature of Times Square. In Washington, there's food trucks everywhere around the tourist areas, and they're a whole feature of that. And yet the caravan selling, Amapleti and Rivonia Boulevard down the road from me, is not considered a feature of our city and is not enabled to trade there, and is in fact actively discouraged. So how do we create an enabling environment which recognizes these things? Recently, probably again, almost a year and a half ago now, there was a well-publicized story of a sandwich seller in Rosebank outside the Standard Bank building who was making 20,000 Rand a month selling sandwiches and supporting his kids. And he was kicked off the street and had his sandwiches confiscated by the Metro Police. Now, this is in a country where we claim a formal unemployment level of 30%, and yet when someone's trying to earn a living, we kick them off the street. The formalization and enablement we need is about creating security of tenure for people who are operating. I wrote about a lady who sells 6,000 Vetkoek every single day in downtown Johannesburg. She's from Limpopo, couldn't find a job. And she sells 6,000 Vetkoek at R1 each and employs 3 staff. And one of the things I said to her is, what do you need? She says, I have no guarantee. So I cannot invest in my business because I have no guarantee. Tomorrow they can kick me off the streets. How do we create that guarantee? And then when we look at other enabling empowerment, I spoke about the credit and other terms, but each one of these sectors requires some form of support, whether it's to help them to comply with zoning, with health regulations, with whatever it might be. But let's look at that differently, and let's look at how we create those. I read a fascinating statistic the other day that in Rwanda it takes you 4 days to register business, and in South Africa 40 days. Now, whether that's true or not, when I started my new business, Kasinomics, I wanted to get a VAT certificate, and I had to sit for 6 hours at SARS in Randburg with my accountant by my side, paying my accountant an hourly fee to do that. Imagine how many businesses, township businesses, can A, leave their business, and B, can have the ability to go and do that for a simple VAT registration. Then at the same time, we complain because they're not paying VAT or they're not paying tax and so on. So let's create environments, let's create the ability for them to fit, but let's also change the regulations to make them suitable to each and every one of these different sectors. The same with government support, or even if it's Jobs Fund, whoever. Let's look at solutions that are relevant to each sector and build this within these sectors. Thank you.
Absolutely, Gigi. Thank you so much for that. And I think the real life examples were quite poignant. We actually have had the results of the Menti question changing as we were engaging. So we had asked, how important do you think it is for businesses in the informal economy to be formalized? The results now show that 36% of participants think that is very important, 26% think it's moderately important, and 17% think it's important. So I think this conversation has started to get people thinking about the question, and some opinions are weighing in, and the pendulum is swinging towards a realization of the importance of this issue. I'm going to ask that we open up the conversation so that we have other delegates asking questions. If you're going to ask a question and you know the person that you like the question to be directed to, in terms of our panelists, please indicate who you want to respond and also indicate your name. So we're going to open it up, and we'll also refer to some of the questions that have been coming through the chat group. Thank you. Do we have any questions from the floor? Any hands?
Through you, Fidelis, there was a question earlier on in the chat function just asking about the statistics and whether perhaps there was an undercounting. Should I quickly kind of just speak to that issue? Sure. The quarterly labour force, I mean, Stats SA really sticks to the international norms around this, around gathering statistics and and actually have fairly good statistics. And sadly, I do think that our comparatively small informal economy is quite accurate. So by way of example, from a research perspective, there was a process of doing time use surveys just to double check that we weren't undercounting work that should be reflected. And it really didn't indicate that there was huge undercounting. So yes, sadly, I think, and I think that one of the reasons why we have a comparatively small informal sector is because our formal sector is relatively strong, and it speaks back to the points that many panelists have raised around kind of value chains. So there was a lovely analysis done of both the bread and chicken value chains, where where there was a question, why aren't there more small players? And what the analysis showed was that the whole value chain was sewed up. And it means that maybe we also, in addition to all the lovely suggestions that have been made through this event, we also need to cast our eye at things like competition policy, not just in the retail space, but in all segments, just to see where it might be, corporate collusion and monopolies might be sewing up opportunities for the smaller players.
Fidelis, perhaps if I can come in and just add to what Caroline is saying. It's important to view the informal sector in context. So, the stat you mentioned that 34% of jobs are contributed by the informal sector. If we take the other stat in terms of 72% of jobs being contributed by the SME sector, what that means is roughly half of the small sector jobs are contributed by the informal sector, and that's quite significant. I don't know if people always, contextualize that properly. So if you look at it from another perspective, the number of organizations within the small sectors, if you look at the formal versus the informal, the number of jobs, the number of organizations is about 1.7 million in the informal sector over, micro to small to medium. And the comparable number in the formal sector is about a third of that. So it's around 600 and some odd. What that means is it just gives you a sense of the scale of the sectors relative to each other, the formal and the informal. Now, if you place that in the COVID context, Beyond COVID tells us in terms of the surveys that we've conducted that SMMEs, so the small businesses, whether formal or informal, are expecting that over the next 6 months, they're going to retrench another 1.2 million people. If we look at the informal sector being half of the full sector size, or half the size of the formal sector, a big chunk of that is going to be job losses in the informal sector. And that's something that we need to bear in mind, because I think as much as the SMME sector in South Africa is potentially neglected, the informal sector within the SMME sector even more so. And if we can't fix these issues, which we all know have been around for a very long time, then we're going to be sitting on massive job losses. You know, we talked about the value chain previously, but corporates cannot continue to do well while the small business sector struggles. And part of the reason for that is because small businesses are integral parts of the big, you know, corporate value chain. So Gigi used the example of, you know, the guys at the side of the road fitting in brake pads that they need to buy from a formal sector business. You know, the value chain is part of it. But the other part of it is, if 72% of the people with jobs in South Africa are going to be getting a hit of what Beyond COVID says is about 13% retrenchments, those job losses are going to filter back through into disposable income. And the money that people are spending in the corporates is going to dissipate. So in terms of the numbers, I think it's quite a sobering perspective. And to address that, we really need to see how we tackle some of the systemic issues we have with small businesses and then informal businesses within that.
Absolutely. Whilst I have you on the floor, Lings, there's a question in the chat. Someone is asking, A2Pay and other developing region successes in the informal economy suggest a key role for technology in integration with the rest of the economy. How much effort or investment is happening in ICT enablement for the sector in South Africa? So maybe you can kick us off and then we can get responses from the rest of the panelists. Lings?
So when it comes to technology, you know, we assisted with the development of a business case for an ICT hub for one of the government departments in Midrand. And it looks specifically at that perspective from a supply perspective, so not so much where it was applied. But one of the things that the initiative wanted to achieve, or wants to achieve, is to foster small companies where we know a lot of the innovation happens, and, you know, spread that out into the rural areas. You get all kinds of people being positioned to make a contribution with regards to technology innovation. That's on the supply side, and I think there's massive opportunity in South Africa for that. Where I guess it's more pertinent to the informal sector is where it actually gets applied. And I think in our minds, you know, as people in the developmental space wanting to assist, we need to draw a distinction between the funky technology and the practical technology. So, you know, in the funky technology space, we assisted a small startup doing very well that was looking to, well, that was in the process of developing a voice cane. So when a blind person walks around, rather than have a cane that they tap against things, it would have sonar and it would tell them when things were in proximity. So that's the funky end of the scale. And I think that's fantastic opportunity for ICT, small ICT companies. With regards to where it can make a difference with small businesses, it tends to be, I think, the more practical stuff. I mean, point of sale terminals are not new. You know, being able to sell airtime is not new. Certainly for the formal sector, it's how we jump over the hurdles to be able to get that through to the people that have historically not been able to access it. So in the agriculture space, there's something called precision farming. So when a smallholder farmer plants a crop, precision farming allows him to decide the crop that's going to give him the best yield. And it also helps him decide how to apply fertilizer per square meter so that he applies the higher levels of fertilizer where it's most needed. So with regards to technology, I think there's lots of potential for that. You know, I remember reading once that whereas the rest of the world in the medical technology space focused on being more insightful, developing more innovative technologies, emerging countries like India were looking to see how they could take the old technologies and make it more affordable and more applicable. I think that's what we need in South Africa, particularly when it comes to small business and informal sector.
Gigi, you want to weigh in?
Hi, yeah, look, I think that I talk about appropriate technology, and I think often, you know, we've got this funky stuff, as Lings call it, but it isn't really appropriate to that space. And I think that you know, that taking existing technology and making it appropriate and relevant is a very powerful kind of move. And as a simple example, what we saw over lockdown was people using fast food outlets like Shisanyamas weren't allowed to sell from their premises, so they placed their menu on Facebook and invited people to send a PIN number and their order, and they'd send an umfan on a bicycle or something running down the road, or you know, so the use of WhatsApp and Facebook has been remarkable, and it is a great platform to utilize. And so, you know, building applications on WhatsApp, you know, you might have a point of sale system that's a physical structure, or you could actually just have a platform where you can scan barcodes using your phone and integrate it with a screen that you purchased at Macro and so on, or from Cash Crusaders and so on. So, you know, I think that there are ways to kind of simplify this process. If I can just add to a kind of previous thing, and this is the Jobs Fund. So, I think two things for me that are very important to consider within the broad context of this conversation. The one is that often, you know, people actually have an informal business as a side business, as a hustle, and we underestimate the extent to which this may not be people's primary income that they claim in terms of research. So I might, you know, I earn a social grant, but I earn, but at the same time, I'm also selling snacks at the school and so on. So there are often multiple incomes in this space. The same backroom rental. You know, I might have a job, but I'm also getting money from backroom rental. So we often need to consider that in looking at the size of this economy and the impact on employment, because someone who's earning a social grant of 340 Rand a month for their kid can suddenly earn maybe another 500 or 1,000 Rand a month, and suddenly they're able to feed their kids and sustain their family in a better manner. And we don't consider often that impact or the benefit of not just being a livelihood, but supplementing your livelihood. And this is an international thing, you know, this kind of supplementing or moonlighting or whatever, having a gig on the side and so on. And so we need to consider those as jobs and the impact of that. And I think the last thing is, you know, half of probably 3/4 of the black people in South Africa who in business were probably brought up by a gogo or sent to school by a gogo who was selling amagwinya on the street corner, or had some sort of little business going. And yet to a large extent, we've forgotten those people that now things have moved on, you know. And I think that the tragedy is that we don't give a pride and a respect and a dignity to people in this informal sector. And I was chatting to a gogo who was selling amagwinya a while ago, and I said to her, "Gogo, you know, do you have a job?" She said, "Ngiyasebenza, anginamsebenzi," which is a play on words. You know, I work, but I don't have a job. And this is the tragedy about how everyone from regulators, government, and so on look at this informal sector. We don't give it the respect and the dignity it requires. And as a result, we don't give it the attention and we don't build models around it to actually uplift these businesses. Because in a sense, we see flea markets, you know, we don't actually see someone who's feeding their kids and so on. We see dirt, we see disorganization, we see informality. These markets and these places are very sophisticated and actually formal in many ways. You'd be surprised. So I just think we need to change the dynamic of what is a job and how we respect people in this space, because that will have run through our entire economy, from regulators to youth who look for a job in the formal sector when they could be starting a SMME of their own.
Absolutely. Thanks, Gigi, and I think you've provided what could actually be fantastic closing remarks. So I'm going to be fair and ask Caroline and Jason to give us just a few seconds of closing remarks.
Great. I mean, I think in addition to all the lovely suggestions that have come up so far, there is this principle in this moment of doing no harm. You know, and goods are being confiscated across the country. It's been amplified. We're hearing it from all quarters. And you know, in terms of disproportionate sanction. There's a lovely lawyer friend who keeps on pointing out that it would be comparable to, in the case of a traffic fine, our cars being confiscated. It has devastating impact. So we really need to just get that baseline right. And then all of these developmental interventions can kick in and really be a game changer for the economy and for people out there.
Absolutely. Jason?
Thanks, Fidelis. 2 points from my side. One, the point that Gigi has mentioned on the technology and the use of technology and so on. So on that, what I'd like to suggest is that it's very important for us to try and avoid the mistakes that have been made historically, which is we find what seems to be a missing link, and we generate that as a template. So if we are looking at technologies, we have to look at the nitty-gritties or the details of how those kinds of technologies function and under what conditions. So in our case, so in the study that we did for the Jobs Fund, we are looking at the use of technology in a very unique value chain. This is different from a private sector value chain, which uses corporate social investment, which has got no monitoring and evaluation system. So we really need to dig into the details of these sorts of stuff. And the second thing, which I know I run the risk of being labeled as an ideologue, but I would insist that we try and maintain our conceptualization right. If it's informal economy, we need to, and especially in a conversation such as this, where we deliberately decide we are going to call it the informal economy, it's not the informal sector. And as Gigi has mentioned, we begin to change the conceptual mistakes or mishaps that occur within the sector, because those have major impact on how the informal economy is viewed generally and on how the informal economy participants themselves, they view themselves. And I think we need not to take that correct conceptual framework for granted. Thanks, Fidelis.
Thanks, Jason. A big thank you to you and all our panelists and everyone who weighed in with inputs and questions. I'd like to remind you to refer to Menti and try and respond to some evaluation questions we posted there. I think we've come to the end of our event, so I'm going to invite the head of the Jobs Fund to give us some closing words. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fidelis. Thank you so much to the panelists and to the participants. This has been an enriching and an energizing conversation, and a very important conversation. And in the Jobs Fund, we hope that through creating this space for these conversations, people take it away into the areas where they work, and that it has impact beyond the Jobs Fund, beyond the projects that we directly support. We couldn't do any of this work without our Jobs Fund partners, their willingness to partner with us, their willingness to be open about their challenges and their experiences, and enabling us to do evaluations and to then come back and share that is a very important aspect of our work. But so often in government, we don't really have, we don't take the time out to track performance, to evaluate what is happening at the coalface, and to use that information to inform new policy. I mean, one of the things that came through strongly in the discussion today is about the fact that, where government does make funding available, it doesn't quite get it right in that this very important sector still struggles and has challenges in accessing that support. We spoke about the importance of aggregators, and we spoke about the importance of having a gender lens as we address the challenges of this particular sector. I think that we've also spoken about the importance of segmenting the sector and designing appropriate support interventions, as well as as incentives. I think I also like the point about the issue of formalization, and what forms of formalization are we confronted with or are we dealing with, and what is the degree of formalization, given that we want to segment this particular sector in a better way than what we have. And lastly, I mean, I just want to say, and I want to echo the sentiment that Caroline has expressed to us, and saying, as we seek to intervene better, let us please remember to do no harm. And so to all the panelists, participants, the Jobs Fund team, the Jobs Fund partners, thank you so much for giving your time and for being willing to engage. And hopefully we can take these conversations further, but more importantly, that these conversations result in better implementation of the kind of support ecosystems that we want to create to make the sector flourish. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a good day further.